to Lillian Hadlin. Lillian was known as the Lavender Lady. And the reason why she was known as the Lavender Lady, because she wore that color every day from head to toe. And the reason why she wore that color every day was her husband absolutely hated it. It was a little bit of a jab at him. But it was said that the marriage to William Lemp Jr. was rocky at best. So every night William Lemp Jr. used to go to bed with a pistol under his pillow, finger on the trigger, and he always made sure the barrel pointed at her head. It's called romancer. But in February 1909, they get a divorce. And the divorce was so scandalous and so many people showed up at the court proceedings that they were forced to build bleachers outside the old courthouse. Hundreds of people would come every day, sit out in the cold of the bleachers. They would open up the windows to the courtroom so the spectators could listen to the scandals being tossed back and forth between the lawyers. It was said that Lillian almost lost custody of her son during the divorce for two reasons. First reason, they caught her smoking in the women's restroom. And the second reason, this is actually the main reason, because the judge thought she showed way too much ankle in court.
Damn.
But 10 years after the divorce, prohibition was passed, and then 1922 sold the brewery at auction, and then on December 28, 1922, William Lemp Jr. was found shot dead. Now, this was Jr.'s office right here. And police found his body slumped over in this corner of his office, shot twice in the heart with the Army Colt revolver. Police originally thought he was murdered, but the coroner ruled it a suicide. Now, to shoot yourself twice in the heart with the Army Colt's a single action, 44 caliber pistol with an 8-inch barrel, nicknamed the Buffalo Killer, because you can stop a buffalo with one shot. Now, to shoot yourself twice in the heart with this gun, you would have to cock this gun, because it's single action, aim it to your heart, pull the trigger. Now, if you manage to hold on to this gun after discharging it, then you have to recock this gun, aim it to what's ever left of your chest, and pull off the second shot. So if he was shot twice in the heart, I do believe he was murdered. As you know, the coroner overrides everybody. It's been ruled a suicide ever since. But after his death in 1922, the mansion sat vacant until 1926, and that's when his next youngest brother moved in, Charles Lemp. Now, Charles Lemp was a hypochondriac and a recluse, and his medication of choice was mercury. Everybody knows that mercury is extremely toxic, but it's also very addictive, and he medicated quite heavily. And on May 10, 1949, the mansion, Charles Lemp decided to shoot his favorite dog. Then he shoots himself in the temple of the room in the back of the mansion on the second floor called the Charles Lemp Suite. And if you go to that room today, they shine a UV light in the corner of the room where he committed suicide. You can still see where the blood poured from his head. But after his death in 1949, the mansion was then sold to the state of Missouri. And the state of Missouri bought the mansion for one reason, and that was the demo had to make way for I-55. Now, the original track of I-55 was to continue through this street here, right down to the Lemp Brewery. But our neighbor, the Diminol Mansion, got put on the historic registry and forced I-55 to deviate around this, so saving the brewery and the mansion. Once I-55 was forced to deviate, the mansion was then sold to Mia Finger. Mia Finger purchased the mansion, turned it into a low-income boarding house. Anywhere from 14 to 20 people would live inside the mansion. They lived in total squalor. But in 1975, the mansion was sold to its current owners, the Pointer family, for $40,000. And since then, the Pointers have renovated the mansion, turned it into a bed and breakfast, a banquet center, and a restaurant. Today it's going on its third generation of family ownership. Now, there's one room in the mansion that's considered to be the most haunted, and that is the nursery. And the nursery's right here. Nobody knows why it's called the nursery, because the Lemps had no children born inside the mansion. If you ask anyone that works in the mansion what that room is used for today, they will say storage. And it definitely looks like a storage room. The only problem with this being a storage room is each of the bed and breakfast rooms generates about $25,000 a year. Multiply that by being in business for 40 years. This has been a pretty expensive storage room for them. Now, a lot of psychics say this is the heart of the Lemp haunting. They say there's a gateway or portal to the other side located in this room. And on Thursday nights, I do an interior tour of the mansion. And while I was doing that tour one night, This came up to the backside of the nursery room door glass and looked out at us. To me, it looks like a little girl. Some people say it looks like a dog.
It looks like a snail.
Yeah?
Now, the mansion also has a ghost that we call the peekaboo ghost. And a lot of people see this ghost staring at them when they spend the night. And if you look where the red circle's at here, you can see the ghost peeking around the corner at this young lady. And I think the only reason why she's smiling is she has absolutely no clue of what's standing behind her. See it? Yeah. Now, the mansion also has a ghost that we call the Lady in White. Now, a lot of people see this ghost walking up and down the main staircase or standing at the top of the main stairs. Here you can see her standing at the top of the main staircase.
Right next to a picture of it.
Oh my gosh.
Now, how many people here watch the ghost hunting shows? You can raise your hand. You be freaks here. I don't anymore because I end up screaming at the TV. But during the ghost hunting shows, they talk about shadow figures. And shadow figures are basically just dark apparitions. Yeah. This shadow figure was captured in the Charles Lemp suite during the day. And the mansion is actually one of the very few haunted houses that I know of where its haunting is just as active during the day than at night. And there was a couple that was spending the night here a few months ago. They woke up in the middle of the night, they threw their room keys in the mailbox, and they went home. They called back later that morning and asked the maid to pack up their luggage and sit it out on the sidewalk because they were too scared to come up to the front porch to get their bags. It's going up there next time. Okay, this cracked stone right here, that's the original property marker for the Lemp mansion. And if you take this triangular parking lot and fold it out into a square, get an idea of what the original size of this lot was before they built I-55. Now in 1929, before the stock market crash, this street used to be known as a Millionaire's Row. But after the stock market crash, this street went from a Millionaire's Row to a Skid Row. And what used to sit in this lot here, actually behind this row of parked cars, was the old Kramer Mansion. And in 1929, after the stock market crash and the Great Depression began, the Kramer Mansion went into foreclosure. It was bought out of foreclosure and turned into the Marion Hospital. And the Marion Hospital was a poor hospital. It catered mainly to the city's homeless and the city's unwanted. And in 1949, when the state of Missouri bought the Lemp Mansion, it allowed the Marion Hospital to use the Lemp for additional patient space. And we estimate that between 1949 and 1960, at least 100 patients in the Marion Hospital passed away within the walls of the Lemp Mansion, thus helping to become one of the most haunted houses in the United States. Now, if you were a patient of the Marion Hospital and you happened to pass away, chances are you couldn't afford burial, or no one was there to claim your body for burial. When that happened, the city of St. Louis would claim your body and bury it in the city cemetery, otherwise known as the Potter's Field. Now, where the Potter's Field used to be located at during the 1950s was at the intersection of Sublette and Byler. Today, that's the location of the Hampton Gardens Apartments. The only problem is there's no record of them ever exhuming the bodies where they moved them to, so a lot of people speculate they built right on top of the old Potter's Field. Now, Steve and DC in the morning. Steve and DC were two very popular morning disc jockeys here in St. Louis during the 1980s. And you can tell this was taken during the 80s because the mullet is this thing called a rope sweater. If you don't know anything about rope sweaters, they came in three basic colors: goldenrod, like you see here, teal, and a color called salmon. Salmon was just a manly way of saying you were wearing pink that day. And if you wore it to high school, you know, all your friends reminded you. But in 1983, Steve and DC did a Halloween broadcast on Lemp. They set up their microphones and they asked the most basic question of any ghost hunt: is anyone with us? And their microphones picked up the EVP I Am Zeke, otherwise known as the Monkey Boy, the Lemp Mansion's most famous ghost. And anybody that was listening to the Halloween broadcast that night heard that EVP come across their radio. Well, people started speculating who Zeke was. They started saying that Zeke was an illegitimate child in the Lemp family, son of a prostitute. He was physically deformed, mentally handicapped, suffered from Down syndrome. They used to keep him chained up on the third floor. People used to see him waving out of the rectangular windows as they passed by on the sidewalk, and the stories go on and on. The only problem with Zeke is a lot of paranormal investigators doubt that he ever existed because there are no Lemp family records that have ever shown that Ezekiel was born into the Lemp family. I happen to believe Zeke did exist, but I do not think he was a member of the Lemp family. I think he was a ward of the state. Because on the other side of the Lemp Brewery on Miami Street once stood an old hospital. And in the 1950s, this hospital was converted into an orphanage. I think Zeke was an orphan that required more care and oversight than they provide for him here. So they moved him to the Marion Hospital where he got better treatment, and for some reason he passed away within the walls of Lemp Mansion. Now one night we did a seance on the third floor, and we captured Zeke's faint apparition in the doorway of the Frederick Lemp Suite. I think that's it for the iPad. Oh, there it is. Cool. It's got water down in it. If you look right here in the doorway, you can see its faint apparition. See it? You guys see it right here?
People in there right now?
Yeah, that's all these. See it right there? You guys everybody get a chance to see it? Okay, our next stop is going to be in front of the St. Agatha's Church steeple, and we're going to walk across the Utah Street overpass to get there. When we do, we can see the drastic change in direction I-55 had to make to avoid tearing down the Lemp. And if you look at this corner of the mansion right here, you can see that I-55 comes within 12 feet of that corner. So another 12 feet this direction, they'd have to tear the mansion down too. All right, let's walk this way. All right.
Zed.
Okay. Francis Tumblety. And I'm not making that name up. This is Tumblety when he was a doctor in Toronto, Canada in 1858. And this was his advertisement when he was a doctor in Toronto, Canada. If you read it, it says two things. It says, one, he's an Indian herb doctor. Now, I know herb doctor today means something completely different, but he's basically a snake oil salesman. And if you read his postscript, it says the doctor would give particular attention to all diseases peculiar to females and young children. This guy's a little bit of a creeper. He actually has the potential of being one of the biggest creepers in history. But for some reason, he was forced to shut down his practice in Toronto, Canada. And in 1860, he shows up in St. Louis dressed as a Prussian army officer with the most impressive mustache ever seen on a gentleman. And the rich and affluent of St. Louis ate this guy up. They gave him a meal, a place to stay, and a little bit of money. He would show up at their homes and regale them of his supposed adventures while he served in Europe. But in 1861, the Civil War breaks out, and Tumblety decides to up his game. He goes to his tailor, has this beautiful officer's uniform made, and he gives himself the rank of colonel in the Union Army. And he's pretty convincing as a colonel, because if you look down Utah Street here across Broadway and Lions Park, off in the distance down there, you're going to see a huge brick building with some white stonework with two lights on top of it. Today, that is the National Geospatial and Intelligence Agency. That is the building where all our nation's spy satellites report into. If you guys want to have some fun after the tour, I highly suggest you go down there, try to ignore all those signs that say lethal force is authorized, and try to take a picture of that building. The men in black will come out and stop you. I'll share this story. I used to point my laser at that building, and I got away with that for about 12 months. Until one tour, a white SUV pulls up right here. And this gentleman in black McKees gets out, and he starts telling me that they need me to stop pointing my laser at their building, because every time that I would set off one of their alarm systems. So I asked the guy, I said, how do you know I'm the one that's pointing the laser at the building while I was holding a laser pointer in my hand? This guy reaches in his truck, pulled out this huge folder, and started showing me aerial photos of my tour. You can clearly see Tumbletee's face in the iPad, and you can clearly see my laser beam pointing at their building. And that is the greatest accomplishment of my tour. I forced the United States government to deviate one of the spy satellites. It could have been Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, ISIS terrorist. But one night in September of 2018, I became the greatest security threat to our nation. But before that building was built, that was the location of the St. Louis Arsenal. And the Arsenal was the headquarters of the Union's Western armies. Tumblety marched in there wearing his brand new uniform, and he convinced the Union Army to pay him the sum of $212 a month. That was the going wage for a colonel during the Civil War. Just that for inflation today, that's about $600 to $300 a month. So now Tumbletee's a colonel. He's getting paid as a colonel, but now Tumblety wants to up his game one more time. He wants to be a doctor again. Now, to be a doctor in the Union Medical Corps, you had to be able to amputate a leg in under 2 minutes. You had to be quick because there's no anesthesia. And how they would do that is two large men would hold you down and shove a leather gag in your mouth. The doctor would then tourniquet the leg, take a large scalpel, cut through the meat and the tendon, saw through the bone, cauterize the wound, sew up the stump. Some doctors so quick they actually cut their fingers off before they realized it. Well, Tumblety passed the test and did become a surgeon in the Union Medical Corps. Now, being a doctor and being a colonel meant he would have to live close to the headquarters of the Union Army, which means he would have to live somewhere here in South Soulard. And we don't know exactly where he lived at in this neighborhood because street lighting has changed drastically since the Civil War, and there's very few antebellum houses left standing. But when he lived in this neighborhood, he was known to give these lavish dinner parties. And during one of these dinner parties, a junior officer approaches Tumblety and asked him, he said, "Hey, Colonel Tumblety, why do you never invite women to your parties?" And that set Tumblety off into a rant. And during that rant, he kept going to this wooden cabinet and pulling out these big, clear glass jars filled with women's body parts. And he gave a lecture on each part of the woman's anatomy and what social evil it caused in society. Now, he didn't show his favorite part of his collection. That he kept in the bottom of the cabinet. Now, there's 15 jars, and each jar contained a woman's uterus. So some people collect baseball cards and bottle caps. Tumblety here, he collected uteri. But in 1863, Tumblety was forced to flee the city because the city of St. Louis charged Tumblety with the crime of wearing medals he did not earn. Today we call it stolen valor. So he flees St. Louis. He goes out to the East Coast where he befriends David Horton. The only problem with David is David was a co-conspirator in the assassination of President Lincoln. David's job was to kill Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. Today we call him the Secretary of Defense. So, Tumblety, for being his friend, Tumblety is arrested, and this is a copy of Tumblety's arrest warrant right here. And Tumblety's actually held prisoner for about 2 months until they realized that Tumblety had nothing to do with the assassination of the President of the United States. So Tumblety's released from jail, and he goes into obscurity in about 1887, 1888, and then he shows up in a small part of London called Whitechapel. But he's forced to flee London in a hurry. So he hops on the very first boat he can find, heading back to the United States. Scotland Yard inspectors hop on the boat right behind him and chase him back. Tumblety reached the port of New York 2 hours ahead of the inspectors, and he's able to slip away and disappear into the crowd. The reason why Tumblety was being chased back to the United States by Scotland Yard with Francis Tumblety was their number 2 suspect for being Jack the Ripper. And this is the St. Louis Globe-Democrat article that calls him out as Jack the Ripper. And this is the Utah Star Chronicle that calls him the Butcher of Whitechapel. So now Tumblety's back to the United States, and he's forced to change his name to Dr. Townsend. And in 1901, Dr. Townsend sets up practice here in South St. Louis. And in 1903, on a deathbed confession, Dr. Townsend admits to being Francis Tumblety, and when they read his will, they found out that he left $100,000 of his estate to the Archbishop of Ireland, and left just enough money to have him shipped up to Rochester, New York for burial. That's where he's laid to rest today. But this was once the neighborhood of a Jack the Ripper suspect. Okay. Any questions? No?
So they don't know he was Jack the Ripper.
They don't know. He's just the number 2 suspect.
They never found out who was Jack.
He was their number 2 suspect. It was just pretty cool that we had a number 2 suspect for Jack the Ripper. Okay. Well, let's go up around the corner here and we'll make our way back to the office. Right here, sir. What's that? Big mistake? Okay. So I'm going to ask what may seem to be a very personal question, but how many people here are Catholic? I'm Catholic. I'm not calling anybody out. Okay. So as Catholics, we have this thing called confession. A confession is a very, very private thing for Catholics. It so private that if a priest ever discusses your confession with another person, they will expel that priest from the priesthood. It's one of the greatest sins a Catholic priest can commit. It's actually one of the very few unforgivable sins in the Catholic religion. So, as a Catholic, one of the last things we'd ever expect to find in a Catholic confessional is a window to the outside world. Now, these are the windows to the old St. Agnes confessional. And a lady one night asked me what those windows were for, and I told her. Then she asked me what the red light was coming from the basement. And I said jokingly the red light was the demon fire. That's where you would go after confession. And she believed me hook, line, and sinker. So we started walking up the next stop. I could hear this lady in the back of the group because she is completely amazed that this church supposedly has an actual pit to hell in its basement. She is also now telling everyone that she is a psychic and claiming that a demon has now escaped the supposed pit of hell and attached itself to her. So I get to the next stop and I tell the lady, I said, ma'am, it really wasn't the glow of the fires of hell that you witnessed. That was the glow of an exit sign. You're not possessed. You're going to be okay. And she was rather upset about not being possessed, that she had a few choice words to say to me, that she stomped off my tour. And I realized that night I can justify any ghost story by saying it's Catholic. And if you doubt me on that, think about how many horror films have Catholic references to them. So about 2 weeks go by, and I get this 3-paragraph, 1-star review from this woman, where she basically calls me a liar and a cheat and a fraud, and that I should refund everybody's money and refund everybody's tips. And I made a promise to this woman, and this promise was this. I will tell this story on every tour from here on out. This is my 7th season of telling the story. I've made people stand out here in the cold, the sleet, the snow, the rain, the heat, the bugs, tornado warnings, thunderstorm warnings. Even when a crazy man was standing in this corner right over here, waving a machete, being tased by 7 police officers, I made people stand here and listen to the story just like I made you all listen to it. I will take the Lemp Mansion off tour before I take this story off tour. It's going up.
Is that your revenge thing?
Yeah.